Grammar Girl here, I'm Mignon Fogarty. This week I have a meaty middle about how to use the word myself, a tidbit about why we talk about getting the skinny on something, why the skinny, and an excerpt of an interview with my editor, Joe Muscolino. But first, I'm going to be speaking in Boston in about a month, and I want to give you an early heads up. I'll be on panels and will also be giving my very first talk at a live show at a conference called Sound Education about educational podcasts. It's November 1st through 3rd at the Harvard Divinity School. I believe I'll be on a couple of panels on Friday, and then the live show is on Saturday the 3rd. The hour-by-hour schedule isn't final yet, but if you're in the area, I wanted to give you some advance notice, and I'll tell you more when I know more. Also, I have a quick correction. Apparently, I have misrepresented blacksmithing. Last week, we talked about middle voice using a question from a listener who heard the sentence, "Those spearheads didn't cast very well," and described it as something a blacksmith would say. Well, another listener named Barton said blacksmiths don't cast metal. They heat it and beat it. Metal workers cast metal. So there you go. I've often said you should trust me about language, but not about sports. And now I guess I need to add metal arts to that list. Thanks, Barton. And now, on to the show. How to use the word myself is one of the top 10 or 20 questions I get. Here's an example.
Hi, Grammar Girl. This is Chuck Tomasi, your intern grammar guy from ChuckChat.com, home of podcasts too numerous to mention. I hear and see examples of the misuse of the word myself all the time. For example, an email went out from HR like this: please contact Squiggly, Aardvark, or myself with questions. Could you please help listeners know when the word myself is appropriate and when to use a more appropriate word? Thanks.
Excellent, Chuck. Let's dissect what's wrong with that sentence. Please contact Squiggly, Aardvark, or myself with questions. The simplest way to think of it is like this. How would you say the sentence without Squiggly and Aardvark? Then it usually becomes obvious. You'd say, please contact me with questions, not please contact myself with questions. So when you add in Squiggly and Aardvark, it doesn't change anything. It's still correct to say, please contact Squiggly, Aardvark, or me with questions. Digging into the topic a little deeper, myself is what's called a reflexive pronoun. That can be hard to remember, but just think about looking in a mirror and seeing your reflection. You'd say, I see myself in the mirror. You see your reflection, and myself is a reflexive pronoun. That's how I remember the name. So, all personal pronouns have a matching reflexive pronoun. Here are some other pairs. You, yourself and yourselves. Her, herself. It, itself. He, himself. One, oneself. Our, ourselves. They, and themselves. And if you're using they as a singular pronoun, some style guides also allow you to use themself as a singular reflexive pronoun. A reflexive pronoun is always the object in a sentence. It can never be the subject. I've talked about this before, but in simple terms, a subject is the one doing something in a sentence, and the object is the one having something done to it. If I hug Squiggly, I am the subject, and Squiggly is the object. You'd never say, myself hugged Squiggly, so you'd also never say, Aardvark and myself hugged Squiggly. At least, you wouldn't say this in standard English. As an interesting aside, some dialects do use some of these words as personal pronouns in the subject position. For example, some Irish people use himself and herself to refer to an important person, like a boss, the head of the household, or in old times, the lord of the castle. So if you're looking for a shop owner in Ireland and he's out, someone working in the store might tell you himself isn't here right now. So if you're Irish or you're writing fiction with Irish characters, you might actually say something like herself hugged Squiggly. But most of the rest of us wouldn't because it's not standard English. Another time when it's correct to use myself in standard English is when you're both the subject and the object of a sentence. This is what's happening when you're using myself as a reflexive pronoun. For example, if you were to say, I see myself playing maracas, or I'm going to treat myself to a mud bath, in both cases, you're the object of your own action, so myself is the right word to use. As another interesting aside, again, in some dialects, people would use me or meself instead of myself in such sentences. For example, you might hear, I'm gonna get me a mud bath, or I found meself at the pub. Meself was actually the way people said it in Old English, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. And some people still say meself as slang or as dialect in certain places such as the Northumbrian region of northern England. It's interesting, but because we're talking about standard English here, myself is the right pronoun for a sentence such as, I told myself to take a deep breath. Also, if you're learning English, you may have noticed that the way we form these words today isn't consistent. If you grew up speaking English, you've probably never noticed this before, but people learning English often ask why we use himself instead of his self and themselves instead of theirselves. Think about it. For some of the reflexive pronouns, we use the possessive before the self part. Myself and yourself. That is my sweater, get your jacket. My and your are possessive adjectives. But for others, we use the object form before the self part. For example, himself and themselves. I gave it to him. I sent it to them. Him and them are object pronouns. The only thing I can tell you is that English isn't logical. These words have changed over time, and they haven't all changed the same way. And sometimes the old way, or the way that seems more logical, continues to exist in dialects. Some people actually do say his self, but it's not the kind of thing you should typically say in a school paper or at work. So if you're learning English, you just need to memorize the standard English forms of these pronouns. Sorry. Moving on. Pronouns like myself and himself can also be used to add emphasis to a sentence. And when they are, they're called intensive pronouns. Same words, just a different name because they're being used differently. For example, if you witnessed a murder, you could say, I myself saw the madman's handiwork. Sure, it's a bit dramatic, but it's also adding emphasis in a grammatically correct way. If you want to emphasize how proud you are of your baking, you could say, I baked that cake myself. Again, it's redundant, but myself adds emphasis. The meaning of the sentence doesn't change if you take out the word myself. It would just have a different feeling because it would lack the added emphasis. So there you go. The quick and dirty tip is to think about how you'd write the sentence if you were the only one in it, and then use that pronoun. For example, please contact me. That's where people usually get hung up on the word myself. And then you can also remember that it's okay to use these pronouns for emphasis and when you're the object of your own action. And I hope you enjoyed the asides about dialects. Before we figure out why we say we get the skinny on things, thanks to our sponsor. If your family has lore about your origins that you want to confirm or refute, you should try Ancestry Dna, the leading consumer DNA test on the market. Ancestry Dna can tell a more complete story of you. Find your origins in more than 350 regions around the world. That's double the geographic detail of any other DNA test. Ancestry Dna combines advanced genetic research with the world's largest online family history database to connect you with your genealogy and heritage. It's an interactive, educational experience that lets you trace your ancestors' migration journeys through time. I was adopted at birth, so genetics and tracing my roots have always been fascinating to me, because it's information that for the longest time was a complete mystery. I know more now, but I'm still really excited to get my results back and see my family history confirmed in black and white. More than 10 million people have discovered their story with Ancestry Dna, and now it's your turn. Learn more about yourself and your own story. Go to Ancestry.com/grammar today for 20% off your Ancestry Dna kit. That's Ancestry.com/grammar for 20% off your Ancestry Dna kit. Ancestry.com/grammar. Next, here's a listener question. Valerie wrote, I just heard "get the skinny" said by a news anchor, and it got me wondering about the origins. Have you covered that one? I hadn't yet, but now I have the skinny, the news, the gossip, or the real truth on the phrase, get the skinny. First, this seems to be a purely American saying, and it's on the rise. A search for the phrase in Google Books shows a steep and steady increase starting around 1975. But the search turned up no use in British English at all, which frankly I almost never see. I almost never see no results at all, so that was striking. The Oxford English Dictionary calls the phrase slang and also says it originated in the U.S. and is still chiefly used in the U.S. The first example there is from a 1938 autobiography by Richard Hallett, a writer who was bumming his way around the world. It doesn't appear to be related to the armed forces in any way, but to other sources, Etymology Online and the Dictionary of American Slang, say the phrase started as World War II military slang, and they speculate that it might have evolved from the idea of the naked truth, which means the plain truth or the truth told without concealment. The World Wide Words website also has an excellent article on the topic and includes a couple of examples of people quoted in the 1940s and 50s saying it's military slang, but that don't seem to tie it back to the naked truth theory. An alternative theory that I found on the Phrase Finder message board is that during World War II, Marines received their military orders on especially thin paper, and these missives came to be called the skinny, as in, what's the skinny on promotions? But I couldn't find anything to back up that theory, and I'm more inclined to believe the naked truth theory, which I've seen from multiple credible sources. That phrase, the naked truth, first shows up in the Rolls of Parliament in 1436 and may have originally gotten some traction after it appeared in a well-known poem from 1585 titled The Cherry and the Sleigh. It was written by Captain Alexander Montgomery, who was part of an influential group of poets who gathered around King James VI of Scotland. In the line, he wrote he truly told the naked truth. The most likely scenario seems to be that phrases such as get the skinny, here's the skinny, or what's the skinny were being used here and there before World War II, then became popular among members of the United States Armed Forces, and then for some reason started appearing in print more and more in the late 1970s and have been increasing ever since. It might have originated as a slangy reference to the naked truth, but nobody knows for sure. And finally, I came across some interesting obsolete meanings for the word skinny as I was reading the Oxford English Dictionary entry. To be skinny used to mean to be attractive as in having beautiful skin, and it also meant related to or affecting the skin, so doctors might have talked about skinny disorders when referring to skin problems. Thanks for the question, Valerie. Finally, a couple of weeks ago, I recorded a conversation with my editor at Quick and Dirty Tips, Joe Muscolino. We talked about words and editing, why he's a lyrics guy, why I call ficus trees Norman, and more. Here's a clip of us talking about what he notices when he's editing and the rule that many Americans want to abandon for the British way of doing things. And so what do you notice, most as you're editing?
So definitely when it comes to editing for audio, make it more conversational. So adding conjunctions for sure. When we read sentences, it's usually like a very defined beginning and end. But when we're talking, it just kind of rolls along, right?
Right.
So make it as conversational as possible. Adding adjectives and adverbs where you feel like it will help sort of emphasize a point that you're making. But generally, when it comes to editing, honestly, what comes to mind first are probably just like the pet peeves that I have, which aren't founded in anything. It's just that because I see them a lot and I'm used to editing them out. I like sometimes can't even help myself be like, oh, why again?
Everyone always wants to tell me their peeves,
right? Yeah, and I know and I get it. Like these like. We should have more patience with any grammatical errors. Like, I should have more patience. But so things like, for instance, Oxford commas. Like
we use them.
We use them.
Yes.
Love them. It adds clarity.
Team Oxford comma.
Team Oxford comma for the win. Because any opportunity you get to add clarity to a sentence, take it. That's what I say.
Yes.
Another pet peeve of mine is punctuations within quotation marks.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that's a style. I mean, it's different between the UK
but our
and
writers
America,
aren't British.
But our writers aren't British. And so I always find myself doing that little delete and then add like a period or add a comma before the quotation mark. So that's another thing I see fairly often.
That's the one rule whenever I post that to Facebook about the rule where the comma and period always go inside the closing quotation mark.
Yeah.
It's the one rule where I always get a lot of comments where people say, I don't care what you say. It looks wrong to me and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. It's a stupid rule. That is the thing. I get the most pushback on that rule. I don't know why, but
That's
people
funny.
hate it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then they're not necessarily UK listeners.
They aren't. They're Americans. Huh. They're like, I'm doing it the other way. I don't care what you say.
I mean, it's going to evolve and it's going to go whatever way it goes. And maybe it ends up being in 100 years from now that we all end up using punctuation outside of quotation marks.
And I tend to be pretty descriptivist. I tend to be pretty laid back, but that is an actual rule.
Yeah.
It's like if you check any style guide, it'll say to do it that way. So
so when I see it always it's like dangling. It's like no,
yes, you should still be
stick it in.
it.
Yeah, tuck it in.
Tuck it in. Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
If you'd like to hear the whole interview, it's the bonus episode this week for Stitcher Premium subscribers. Sign up at stitcherpremium.com/grammar and use the code GRAMMAR for a free 1-month trial. I'm Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl. That's all. Thanks for listening.